Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a different kind of video. Normally I would avoid a video that's produced to be flashy and instead opt for one that is more of a get down to business style, but I thought I'd take a look at this video that was put up as a segment of the 700 Club. So this isn't an apologetics deep dive that will only be seen by people that are actually interested in that specific topic. This is more of what your average run-of-the-mill Christian might be exposed to just while watching TV. So in theory, this is more representative of what the average Joe will think of the matter. So let's see how well the 700 Club is equipping its viewers to counter the non-Christian claims.
Alex McFarland is a leading Christian apologist.
I usually do some cursory Googling of the people that show up in the videos that I respond to because occasionally I find some fascinating little nuggets. Like in this case, this Alex McFarland guy has a master's degree in Christian thought from Liberty University. Now, if that's an historical study of how Christian thought has evolved throughout history, that could be a fascinating topic to study, but somehow I doubt that. Anyway, he's the type of apologist who argues that millennials are leaving the church because of the breakdown of the family, so that tells you pretty much all you need to know about him.
If you're wondering, that doesn't mean he apologizes for the faith. It means he defends Christ's history and shows why you can trust it.
Yes, a strange profession indeed if the things that he is defending are actually true things. You'd think that God could defend himself and not rely on fallible humans who regularly screw up the job, but here we are.
To get there, he first explains what historians want.
They want eyewitness testimony. They want multiple testimony. They want early testimony. And the fourth is hostile testimony.
These certainly aren't the only criteria for historians when they are deciding which events likely happened as reported and which were exaggeration or fabrication, but they are some of the criteria. Important to keep in mind, though, is that when dealing with historical documents, all conclusions are tentative. That is, any conclusion that we come to has the potential to be overturned if we later find a better source that disagrees with the current tentative conclusion. It is all quite complex, but suffice it to say for now that it's not anywhere near as simple as just eyewitness testimony, early testimony, multiple testimony, and hostile testimony. But all that being said, even if I grant those four criteria as the only criteria necessary, we barely even have any evidence for the existence of Jesus, much less that anything he said or did was recorded accurately.
As for eyewitness and early, the Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are by men who either knew Jesus in the flesh or got their facts from eyewitnesses, like Mary, the mother of Jesus, and others.
Nope. Not a single one of those books was written by someone who knew Jesus himself. All of the books are written anonymously, with the earliest one being written at least 30 years after the events it's reporting on, and that one is one of the ones that is most definitely not an eyewitness account. One of the other ones, the only one that even comes close to claiming to be the report of eyewitnesses, copied a good chunk of this earlier, definitely non-eyewitness account word for word. This is an important detail because when examining a source for its reliability, one of the things that we look at is if there are several independent sources that contain the same message. The fact that Luke and Matthew copied large portions of Mark word for word indicates that these three Gospels are not independent. As such, they essentially count as one source. John, well, not copying directly from Mark like the other two, clearly had access to those accounts as he often specifically contradicted them for what appear to be theological reasons. John wanted Jesus to be more clearly God in human form, while the other three showed Jesus to occasionally be at least slightly fallible and subject to human weaknesses. Even church tradition on the authorship of John has him writing with full knowledge of the earlier Gospels, him deciding to record what he saw in a vision at the urging of his companions, but being reluctant because of the already extant Gospels. My point is, from an historical perspective, John shows awareness of the other Gospels, so is not entirely independent. So we've got, if I'm generous, two sources for the life of Jesus. Now, what do historians do when two sources disagree about an event, as often happens between John and the synoptics? They prefer the source with the most authority, the source created by an expert, or which is a direct eyewitness testimony. Since the Gospels are all anonymous, we have no way of determining the expertise of the authors, and none of them even claim to be eyewitnesses. So what do we do with this information? We lower our standards to let the Gospels in as authoritative anyway, apparently.
Paul's epistles are written by a man who encountered the resurrected Christ.
Yes, Paul's epistles are written by a man who had a vision. Forgive me, but I don't think that hallucinating years after the fact counts as being an eyewitness to the events.
We have got the Gospels coming to us from less than 10 years after the cross.
No, we absolutely do not. How did you come by that date? The accepted scholarly consensus is several decades later than that. Even Gary Habermas, professor of apologetics at your alma mater, Liberty University, agrees with the scholarly consensus. The only thing that we can potentially say was maybe written that early is the creed that Paul recites in 1 Corinthians 15. That's the bit about Jesus having appeared to Cephas, to the 500, and lastly to me. There is evidence that this is an early creed that was recited in the church before Paul joined up. Depending on who you ask, and whether they are speaking casually or professionally, this creed could date to anywhere in between 3 months and 5 years of Jesus' death, or later, but the book we find it in definitely wasn't written until a few decades later, and as it is a creedal recitation, it doesn't give us an eyewitness account. At best, it gives us an account of what early Christians believed.
Compare that to the 643 ancient copies of Homer's Iliad, whose authenticity scholars don't question.
Scholars don't question the authenticity of the Iliad? Really? So, when learning about Greek history, students are taught about the historical figures of Achilles and Odysseus? It is an epic poem. It contains references to real places and potentially some real events, but scholars today still aren't even sure if the Trojan War happened or if Troy was even a real city. Maybe next time you want to compare the reliability of biblical sources to real historical documents, try using a real historical document for your comparison rather than a fictional epic poem.
But from the time of the writing to the copies we have, more than 500 years. In fact, around 900 years. We've got the Annals of Caesar, which comes to us in several dozen copies. But again, from the earliest copies we have, the time of writing, nearly a millennia, 1,000 years.
Oh, the equivocation is strong with this one. When he's talking about the dates of writing for the books of the New Testament, he's trying to imply that the original authors were writing within 10 years of the events, which, if we correct that to line up with the scholarship on the issue, is actually 30 to 90 years after the events when they were originally written. But when talking about the Annals, he says that they were written over 1,000 years after the fact. If I'm generous and say that he's not flat out lying, at best he can be referring to the oldest extant manuscripts of the Annals, which are about 1,000 years after the events, but Tacitus wrote the Annals around 116 CE, and they cover a time period going from 14 CE to 68 CE, so he was writing about 50 to 100 years after the fact. You were off by an order of magnitude. But if we use this sort of methodology for the Bible, we end up with the oldest manuscripts being a tiny scrap from the book of John that dates to the 2nd century. In order to make this work, you have to play fast and loose with how you're defining the time of writing, meaning the oldest intact manuscript when talking about the writings of Tacitus, but date of original writing for the Bible. This is downright deceptive.
Compare that to the main facts about Christ.
The core of Jesus' identity message credentials was in circulation regularly within 8 weeks after the cross.
How do you even come by that number? The closest thing we have to any sort of details about Jesus that can be dated to earlier than 20 years after the fact is that one creed, which may have been only a handful of years afterward. But even if I put that one at 8 weeks after the cross, all that says is that there was a tradition that started early that Jesus appeared to some people. Unsourced traditions are not historical documents.
As for hostile testimony, or at least not pro-Christian, many outside sources wrote of this Jesus.
Many outside sources wrote about Christians and the things that they believe, including some details about what they believe about Jesus. If I say Tom Cruise is a Scientologist, they believe in an alien named Xenu who blew up a bunch of people on the Earth millions of years ago with H-bombs, resulting in Thetans adhering to humans and causing spiritual harm. This is not me corroborating the account of Xenu having done these things. It is simply me reporting the beliefs of others.
A worker of wonders did miracles, claimed to be God, crucified at Passover. The core facts of the gospel, death, deity, and resurrection, just based on ancient Jewish, Greek, and Roman sources that certainly were no friend to the burgeoning church.
That whole thing was essentially a summary of the parts of the Testimonium Flavianum from Josephus that is known to be a later Christian forgery. But, I mean, this really shouldn't surprise me at this point. Someone who is willing to mislead others about the authorship dates of ancient documents would obviously have no qualms with accepting known forgeries as authentic passages. Next, he'll be saying that Paul wrote 14 books of the New Testament, as though that were an undisputed fact. For the record, Paul wrote 7.
That's very compelling to historians because it represents objectivity, that those no friend of the movement also corroborate the core facts of what we know about Jesus.
No, what is compelling to historians is the evidence that that passage in Josephus was a later Christian forgery. There may be some truth at the bottom of it, but when you take away all the obvious later Christian additions, you're left with Christians existed and they believe in this Jesus dude. Notably, no church fathers before Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, thought to quote this prominent Jewish historian who so thoroughly confirmed the account of Jesus in the 1st century. This is an incredibly important detail to omit. Now, of course, our not having found any such document does not prove that it is a forgery, but it is by no means our only line of evidence that leads there.
Filmmaker Rick Larson finds proof of Christ and the miraculous world around him in a whole different sphere, scientific evidence.
Yeah, because when looking for scientific evidence of past events, the intellectual property lawyer is the guy you want to go to first. Well, at least he'll be able to tell you that my use of this video is pretty obviously covered by fair use, right? So there's that.
There are 2 great events in Christianity. There's the incarnation and there's the execution and resurrection. Those are the 2 great events.
I counted 3. Incarnation, execution, and resurrection. Never trust a lawyer who can't count to 3.
And those 2 things, God chose to leave hard evidence that we can find today and show that they occurred.
Well, I hope it's better evidence than we've seen so far.
In the Star of Bethlehem documentary, Larson found there really was a light in the heavens that guided the wise men to baby Jesus. It was even shown on coins made at the time.
I was curious what Larson thought the star was. This video never actually says, it just moves on as though saying someone found the actual star should be enough for us. Well, Larson found, using a program that can extrapolate the positions of astronomical objects into the past, that there was a triple conjunction of the planet Jupiter and the star Regulus in 2 BCE. Now, of course, this leaves us with a tiny little problem. King Herod, who is featured prominently in the version of the story that involves the Star of Bethlehem, died 2 years before that event. Astronomy is such a huge data set that you'd think you could have found an astronomical event that would have had a main character of the story not 2 years dead. The point is, if you have a large enough data set, you can find patterns when you look for them. Pick a day in history and you can probably find some astronomically significant event that happened on or near that day. And probably my favorite little detail is that he says this triple conjunction happened on December 25th. Firstly, a triple conjunction is an event that happens over a span of months. For instance, the 2010-2011 Jupiter-Uranus triple conjunction happened between June of 2010 and January of 2011. But secondly, the December 25th date for Jesus' birthday wasn't decided on until the year 336, and it is either entirely arbitrary, or it was chosen by the newly Christian Emperor of Rome to be a replacement or supplement for pagan winter solstice festivities. As to the coins, sometimes coins had stars, there's nothing special about that. I can't find anything on those specific coins, but I don't see why an event as unremarkable as a triple conjunction would warrant being included on coinage. But for other examples of coins with stars, there's this one that was in circulation from 27 BCE to 14 CE, this one from 98 to 117 CE, this one from about 300 BCE, and there are many more. In fact, these coins are specifically coins that not only have stars, but also crescent moons. So he found a minor astronomical event that happened a couple years too late to actually be the right one, and a coin with a star on it that he assumes is depicting this astronomical event. This is not terribly impressive evidence.
The Christquake shows how Larson's crew found in ground, once covered by the Dead Sea, the geologic ripples of the gigantic earthquake that split rocks at the very hour of Jesus' death.
Gigantic earthquake is probably more than a bit of an overstatement. If we look at the geologic record, there is evidence of a small magnitude earthquake that happened in the Dead Sea area sometime between 5 and 50 CE. This is then assumed to be the earthquake that was talked about in Matthew by virtue of the fact that no other sources exist in that time period describing any earthquakes in the area. But with regards to the Matthew account of this earthquake, it's in a part of the book that some Christian New Testament scholars argue is not meant to be taken as a literal historical account of the events, as Dr. Mike Licona explains here.
I think what's going on here, when you look at the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature of the period, that would seem to suggest that Matthew does not mean for us to understand these in a historical sense, but he wants us to see these as what we would call as portents.
So if the author of Matthew was reporting on a real earthquake that happened, it was minor enough to have not been mentioned by anyone else in history. But there is evidence to suggest that that portion of the text is not speaking literally, and so there's no reason to assume that such an earthquake was an historical event. But yeah, best case scenario here is that there was a minor tremor sometime around Jesus' death in an area where minor tremors are not uncommon.
Gordon, the Gospel of Matthew mentions both the Star of Bethlehem and the earthquake at the cross, and Larson, as he was just saying there. There's scientific evidence for both of them.
Nope. Matthew is literally the only source that mentions either of those, and there happened to be a small tremor in a geographically active area within a 45-year time period that happens to overlap with the time Jesus was supposed to have died, and a small point of light in the sky got close to another small point of light in the sky 3 times in 1 year, so that counts as a large, easily noticeable star hovering over a very specific house in Bethlehem at least 2 years earlier. This is not very convincing evidence.
As for the written record, there are some 30,000 ancient fragments, portions, whole copies of the New Testament, far more than Homer's Iliad or biographies of Caesar.
How many copies there are of a book in no way indicates how accurate that book was when it came to reporting on historical events. The vast majority of those copies were written over 1,000 years after the fact. Do you know how many manuscripts we have from the 1st century? 0. How about the 2nd century? Well, for that we have 8 tiny little scraps of manuscripts. The first complete New Testament doesn't show up until the 4th century. So tell me, why is someone copying out a text hundreds of years after the event that the text is talking about supposed to add reliability to the text itself? It doesn't. It merely attests to the perceived importance of the document, not the document's accuracy.
Gordon?
Well, I've got to ask, Paul, why the doubt? Why do you think so many more people accept Homer, accept Socrates, but then doubt that Jesus Christ really lived?
I think you'll find that academia is full of people who doubt the historical existence of people like Achilles and Odysseus. As to Socrates, most modern scholars do accept him as really having existed, but there is much doubt as to what happened in his life. We only really have 2 sources, both from people claiming to be direct eyewitnesses to his life, and both contradictory. Are you sure you want to stick with this comparison? Because if we're strict enough with our criteria to cast doubt on Socrates, then there is no way anything from the Gospels are going to pass muster. Oh yeah, and those 2 eyewitness sources, those are the only 2 complete sources. There are 4 more fragmentary sources, all from people who claim to have known Socrates personally, and then 25 years after Socrates' death came a satirical play that poked fun at him. So, for Socrates, we have multiple, definitely independent sources, and with all of that, there is still some question as to his historicity, albeit not much of one.
You know, I think what's interesting about this is you can believe those guys, you can see proof of them in history and all that, but I think it doesn't really affect people. But if you believe that Jesus Christ existed, then you have to face, well, is he crazy or was he lying? He's saying he's the Son of God.
No, absolutely not. You can concede that Jesus existed without asking any of those questions. He could have just been a typical apocalyptic rabbi for the time who happened to have a legend grow up around him. This is just a clumsy rephrasing of C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, lord argument, which is a false, what is it when there's 3, a trichotomy? False trichotomy, sure, why not?
So maybe you like all his teachings and everything, but there's that core question that he's saying he's the Son of God, and we've got his resurrection to deal with. And then so people have to then say, well, then, if all of that is true, then that proves there's a God, and I have to face that fact, and I have to make a decision. And so therefore, I think that's the thing. People don't necessarily want to have to face that decision. They don't want to necessarily have to give their life to their lords.
That's not actually how any of this works. An admission that the character of Jesus in the Bible was based on a real dude who really existed does not actually lead you to having to accept all of the stories about him in the Bible, just as admitting that the Roman Empire once really had an emperor named Vespasian is not an automatic concession that Vespasian was able to heal the blind and infirm, as was reported about him in Tacitus.
So he's been challenged throughout all of these last 2,000 years, and I think as long as there's mankind, there'll always be those challenges.
Yeah, that's true. But he's the one who split BC into AD, so we need to keep that in mind.
Why would we need to keep that in mind? Most people count the years using the same method as the culture they're in does not mean the event that is purported to have started the calendar ticking is a true event. Also, if we want to be really pedantic, there is no way that Jesus was born at the beginning of 1 CE, so the calendar split from BCE to CE a few years after he was born. So, was it really his birth that did the splitting? And, of course, you'd likely bristle at my use of before Common Era and Common Era rather than before Christ and Anno Domini, but that's kind of the point. At this point, we're still using the years that we use more out of convenience than anything else. The switch to BCE and CE is just an acknowledgement of this fact. It's removing the religious significance in order to be more respectful to people who don't consider us to be living in the year of our Lord.
You've interviewed several famous apologists over the years. Why do they end up becoming such fierce defenders of the faith?
Oh, I know this one. It's because God is incapable of speaking for himself, so he requires a bunch of fallible humans to go out there and spread the contradictory and mutually exclusive messages about him, right?
I think because they were such fierce enemies of the faith at the start.
A lot claim to have been, but they were also usually raised Christian. Interestingly, it's incredibly rare to find someone who starts out as an atheist and winds up becoming an apologist for a religion that is not the dominant religion in their native culture. It does happen, sure, but it is incredibly rare. I would be willing to bet that if he starts listing examples, they are all going to be people who grew up in majority Christian societies.
We've got guys like Josh McDowell, who was a legal scholar, across the Atlantic to find out. He was basically sent out to find out, to do a paper that would disprove God existed.
Why do you have to blatantly lie like that? Josh McDowell was not a legal scholar. He was a law school student who never finished the law degree. He wasn't sent across the Atlantic to write a paper on Christianity. He grew up in Union City, Michigan, and went to Battle Creek, Michigan for school, which is where he decided to write a paper examining the historical evidence for Christianity. He certainly has crossed the Atlantic in his missionary work, but you're making it sound like he was hired as some sort of legal investigator and was sent on an international mission to disprove Christianity, when the truth isn't even close to that.
And he ended up finding so much evidence for him that he became a believer. We got guys like cold case detective J. Warner Wallace.
I looked at Wallace here recently. The general consensus for Wallace seems to be that people really hope he used a higher bar for evidence in his detective work than he did for Christianity.
We've got C.S. Lewis, a man, one of the most brilliant scholars in the world, who didn't want to believe, but found so much evidence that he believed.
I wouldn't necessarily call the guy who came up with the liar, lunatic, Lord argument a great scholar. He was certainly a good author. I enjoyed his fiction books even with the complete lack of subtlety with his allegories, but he wasn't a terribly good apologist.
And even Lee Strobel, journalist, used all his skills as a journalist to investigate and became a fierce believer.
Yes, I used to not believe, then I looked into it, and now I do believe, is one of the most common stories told by apologists of many religions. But I changed my mind once is not really a convincing argument for everything. The reasons you change your mind are what is important, and so far you've only brought up people who I am already familiar with, and none of their stories are really compelling. None of them give good reasons for actually changing their beliefs.
So, and even in my own life, I was an atheist right during the Jesus People movement, spent hours and hours in my high school trying to talk young people out of their faith until finally I had to face that question about, hold it here, what is my evidence that he doesn't exist? And I finally ended up searching, and until there was a moment when I was saying, God, you've got to show me, are you real or not? And had an encounter where God himself said, just ask me. And I said, are you real? And he said, I am.
Well, forgive me for doubting, but so far on your program, you have shown yourself to be, shall I say, extremely comfortable with presenting misrepresentations as though they are factual. So while I don't doubt that there is at least a kernel of truth to the story, you have not shown yourself to be trustworthy enough for me to just take you at your word. But also, as predicted, Every example given was of someone converting to the majority faith in their culture. And with regards to your personal experience with God, I'll just let J. Warner Wallace, who you already mentioned, cover that one.
Most of the time, these are answers that are rather emotional, and sometimes, to be honest, they sound just like the kinds of answers that other theistic believers like Mormons would give.
It is a bit weird to me that he would choose another branch of Christianity to lump into the other theistic believers category. Personally, I'd have gone with an example outside of the Christian sphere, but the point still stands. Personal experience is not sufficient reason to justify belief, because personal experience is pretty much universal across all religions, and if God really is communicating that way, that means he's appearing to be different gods to different people, depending on their cultures and beliefs.
And I gave my heart to him because, again, I ran right into the guy. There was no doubt, because there he was right in front of me.
Well, Paul, thanks for the insight and thanks for being with us. And for you at home this Easter, realize that you have to make a decision. Is Jesus real? Is he who he says he is?
Was he real? Maybe. But is he who the Bible says he is? No, I am not convinced, and this 6-minute program full of outright and obvious falsehoods is not going to do the job of convincing me. But then, this program isn't meant to convince non-believers, is it? That's why I picked this video. This is not in-depth apologetics targeted toward people who are actually interested in learning about the subject. This is a quick segment on a Christian show on a Christian network that will mostly be watched by Christians, which isn't meant to be anything more than a fluff piece to reassure the less intellectually invested believers that, even if they don't want to look into the evidence themselves, there are people that have, so you don't need to worry about it. It's really insidious, and it explains why atheists such as myself still run into tired old arguments that don't even make sense if you think about them just a little bit, like that Christ split the calendar argument. These are sincere believers who haven't really encountered real objections to their faith, but have been steeped in programming such as this, which tries to reinforce the idea that no real objections actually exist. It's all grasping at straws. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Angelica Skorosizin. I'm sorry for mispronouncing that, I'm sure I did. Who says, they were written at a time when people who have seen Jesus could refute it. And yet, even nowadays, people are not immune to mass propaganda or simply the Mandela effect. Yes, the Mandela effect is a prime example of faulty memory being combined with absolute certainty that your memory is not faulty. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it's basically a term that people use when there's an event or detail that multiple people misremember in the same way. It gets its name from Fiona Broome, who remembers Nelson Mandela having died in prison in the 80s, despite the fact that he didn't die until 2013, and was president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. She claims that thousands of people all remember it like she does, and rather than come to terms with the fact that human memory is fallible, they instead believe that they have slipped through the fabric of space-time from an alternate dimension in which their memories are accurate. Or at least that's one hypothesis. And this can be small details, like the spelling of Berenstain and the Berenstain Bears, or pretty big events, like the aforementioned Nelson Mandela dying in prison some 30 years before he actually died, or the existence of a movie called Shazam, starring Sinbad as a genie. And we live in a time when we can check details like that. You can go out right now and buy a Berenstain Bears book and look to see how it's spelled for yourself. And it's not hard to find old copies at used kids' stuff stores, so you can make sure that they didn't just change it on you later. You can search databases like IMDb for movies like Shazam and find no record, but a suspiciously similar Kazam movie starring Shaq. And a tiny amount of digging yielded the interesting little fact that Kazam was advertised on a number of VHS tapes of some of Sinbad's shows, so it's easy to see how the two could become associated with each other. Given how prolific the idea is that Sinbad definitely starred in a genie movie called Shazam today, just 27 years after it was supposed to have been released, in this time with excellent record keeping and easy access to these records, is it really out of the question that the stories of Jesus' life could have become exaggerated over the 30-year period between his death and the first detailed account of his life being written, in a time when records were much harder to verify? Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the law firm that sent the legal scholar that is my channel across the Atlantic. If you'd like to be a complete fabrication, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!